Australia, the United Kingdom, and United States have formed a new military alliance called AUKUS. As part of this alliance, Australia will receive new missiles and a fleet of nuclear submarines built by the US and UK. Meanwhile, the United States will increase its military presence and operational capability in the region. This pact has angered France, who lost out on a contract to originally build diesel submarines for Australia. It's also been condemned by China, which views this increased militarization and buildup of foreign troops in its region as a threat. So what exactly is AUKUS? Is it really about promoting regional peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, or part of a larger power struggle seeking to provoke China and project Western influence? I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. On September 15th, the Prime Ministers of Australia and the United Kingdom, Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson, along with the President of the United States, Joe Biden, issued a joint statement announcing a new military partnership between their three countries, called AUKUS. As part of this trilateral agreement, Australia would receive a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. These would be built at Adelaide in South Australia with the help of the UK and the US. Australia confirmed that it would also be acquiring Tomahawk cruise missiles and joint air-to-surface standoff missiles from the US. In exchange, the United States will expand its already giant military footprint in Australia. The United States and Australia already have very close ties, being two of the Five Eyes members, along with the UK, Canada, and New Zealand. The US already has several military bases and around 2,500 Marines on permanent rotation in Australia. In addition to its own bases, the Asia-Pacific Journal writes that, quote, the US military has access to all major Australian Defence Forces training areas, Northern Australian Royal Air Force airfields, port facilities in Darwin and Fremantle. With AUKUS, those numbers would increase, as would the types of ordnances, as Peter Dutton, the Australian Defence Minister, confirmed. During a press conference, he went on to say that Australia and the United States will be significantly enhancing our force posture cooperation, increasing interoperability and deepening alliance activities in the Indo-Pacific. This will include greater air cooperation through rotational deployments of all types of US military aircraft to Australia. Now, while this agreement has been marketed as a defense pact, there are many who feel that Australia is giving much more than it's receiving, conceding much of its territorial, political, and military sovereignty to the United States. And nothing could be more emblematic of Australia's subservience to the United States than Joe Biden forgetting the Australian Prime Minister's name, Scott Morrison, during the unveiling of AUKUS.
Thank you, Boris. And I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal.
Besides not being able to say the name of the Australian Prime Minister, neither Biden nor Johnson and Morrison actually mentioned China by name. If you go and watch their full speeches, you'll only hear them say the Indo-Pacific.
The Indo-Pacific.
The Indo-Pacific.
We all recognize the imperative of ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific over the long term.
It's no secret that this entire thing is aimed at China. This is China's region after all, and the West has been fear-mongering about them for years. Reacting to AUKUS, the spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Li Jianzhao, said that, quote, this severely undermines regional peace stability, intensifies arms race, and undercuts international non-proliferation efforts. It's highly irresponsible and shows double standards on using nuclear export for geopolitical games. So why China? What has China done that is so bad that these three countries are trying to gang up against it? Well, I think this clip from CNN might have some of the answers.
The trade routes that we use on the open seas need to be protected in the US and Australian and UK view. They need to be protected by our collective forces in order to make sure that no other navy can interfere with the trade routes as they exist right now. So that means any oil, for example, that comes from the Middle East, any raw materials that come from Africa, things that China depends on a great deal.
But have they been doing that? Have the Chinese been stopping those trade routes?
Not yet. But the fear is that they could.
Well, there you go. You heard it straight from the horse's mouth. The colonel here is plainly saying China hasn't done anything. And more importantly, he's telling you the real reason behind all this. It's all about economic interests. It's about controlling shipping lanes, trade routes, oil and other natural resources near China. Which again, remember, China is the world's largest manufacturing country. And when they talk about countering China, this phrase, they use it all the time, but what does it mean? Why does China need to be countered? America has tons of military bases already surrounding China, not the other way around. And what is the United Kingdom doing on the other side of the planet? Do you know that China is Australia's largest trading partner? Why should Australia sour relations with them at the behest of the US? What, to satisfy America's foreign policy goals? Perhaps this is more to do with the West feeling nervous that China has a stronger, faster-growing economic model. China is on track to overtake the US and become the world's largest economy. China has the Belt and Road Initiative, a modern revival of the Silk Road trade route. It just recently integrated Iran into it, among many other countries. China doesn't go around bombing other places to steal their resources. China has lifted millions of its own citizens out of poverty. It has a different mindset, a different social and economic system from the US. And Australia seems to be losing its sovereignty and essentially becoming a giant airbase for the Americans. Australia says it's non-nuclear, but will the United States respect that? Who's to say they won't keep nuclear missiles on Australian soil in secret? Does the US view Australia as expendable, perhaps just as a vassal state that it can exploit for its imperialist ambitions in a potential confrontation with China? To find out more, I thought I'd ask Dr. Alan Patience. He's an honorary principal fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He's taught political and Asian studies at universities in Australia and Japan, and has occupied visiting professorships in China, Taiwan, Burma, and Papua New Guinea. His work focuses on Australian foreign policy. Dr. Alan Patience, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on.
My pleasure.
Professor, you recently wrote that Australia is repeating certain foreign policy and defense mistakes from the last century. I was hoping if you could maybe elaborate on those mistakes for us.
Okay. Well, I was referring in that case to the 1919 peace conference in Paris after World War I. The Australian representative was our Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Billy Hughes, who was one of the leading architects of what was called the White Australia policy. He was an out-and-out racist and particularly disliked Asian people. The Japanese, of course, were represented at the peace conference in a quite significant delegation. They made some proposals that upset the Australian Prime Minister. The first proposal was that, all German territories in the Pacific should be encouraged and helped by Australia and Japan together towards independence, to end colonialism, German colonialism. And the second proposal that the Japanese made was that the new charter for the League of Nations that was being formed at much the same time should have an anti-racist clause in its charter. Now, Billy Hughes was absolutely horrified at these two suggestions. He opposed them bitterly. He was extremely rude in the conference proceedings. He used to put his foot up on the table and shout and just gesticulate, particularly at the Japanese, telling them off. And as a result, the Japanese, first of all, were humiliated at that conference. Eventually, they withdrew from the League of Nations. And certainly that was a contribution to the enmity that was created between Japan and Australia in World War II in the Pacific Theatre. And what I was trying to suggest is that Scott Morrison, our present Prime Minister, is doing exactly the same thing. He's now being very rude about China in a number of international forums and provoking China's hostility. So I think history is repeating itself.
When it comes to Australia and what Australia has to gain from all this, these nuclear submarines, it's said they won't be arriving anytime soon. As a matter of fact, we've heard the year 2040 being floated around. So if Australia has to wait 2 decades for these submarines, what exactly are America and the UK gaining in the meantime from this partnership with Australia, especially in terms of being able to use Australian territory and soil?
First of all, I think it's important to note that there is no submarine at the moment. All there is a promise that nuclear power will be made available for whatever submarine is chosen in a time frame of the next 18 months. So it's still a fantasy. It's not a reality at all. What will the Americans achieve? Well, for a long time now, Australia's military capacity, defence capacity, has been, and I've got to use an awful official word here, interoperable with the United States military. That is to say, we are really just a very small part of the US military and defence arrangements in the Asia-Pacific region. This now consolidates that relationship as far as the Americans are concerned. There's been some talk emerging in Australia, particularly during the time of Trump's presidency, that maybe we can't rely on America any longer. And that's a feeling that's been growing. And the Americans want to counter this. And they've come in now with this proposal. And that's what, and at the same time, and by the way, the concerns about America's reliability, we'd had one former Prime Minister, for example, saying that it's time to rip up the alliance with the United States. And that would mean, amongst other things, kicking Pine Gap, which is a huge American spy base in the middle of Australia that's been spying on China and other East and Southeast Asian countries, getting rid of that, for example, and that would really remove a major part of the US's intelligence capacity, gathering capacity in this region. So America is in pushing us into this arrangement, if you like, is consolidating its grip on Australia's sovereignty very strongly. As far as the British are concerned, I think it's just empire nostalgia. They still think of Australia as a colony, and in many respects we still are a colonial mindset. And yes, it's, for the British, they might get one of their submarines selected, but it's very unlikely. I'm sure it'll be an American submarine.
You mentioned Australian sovereignty. What does AUKUS entail exactly for Australia's sovereignty? How does it get out of this colonial mindset?
I think it's important to note that in international politics, international relations, Australia styles itself as a middle power, a so-called middle power. I've argued elsewhere that there are different kinds of middle powers, but the kind of middle power that Australia is as a dependent middle power. Its claims to have a kind of middle power status are entirely reliant on its alliances with big powers, and in this case, the United States. So already, as a dependent middle power, Australia's sovereignty has been severely constrained. As the former Prime Minister that I was referring to earlier, Malcolm Fraser, he was a Conservative Prime Minister, by the way, who's saying, let's get rid of the American alliance. And he was saying, look, Australia has very little sovereignty. And AUKUS, as they call this new strange arrangement, is yet further evidence that we are very lacking in sovereignty, that we will always do as we're told. And that's evident, for example, in that Australia has been into every single war that the United States has had since the end of World War II, during World War II as well. We've been into every single war. Korea Peninsula War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. It's quite extraordinary. In many respects, we're a very warmongering country, but very keen to be with America in its wars.
Dr. Alan Patience, thank you so much for your time, Professor. Really a pleasure speaking with you and having you on. AUKUS has caused a real diplomatic row with the French. France is actually very upset with all this, not because Western imperialists are antagonizing China, but because they didn't get the contracts and the money to help do it. France had a deal worth 90 billion Australian dollars to build diesel-powered submarines for Australia. Without informing the French, Scott Morrison just went and ripped up the contract and entered Australia into this new alliance instead with the US and the UK. I guess he figured that American nuclear-powered submarines would be much better. And France, of course, considers this to be a real stab in the back, and is so angry, it pulled out of a planned ceremony with the US, commemorating the 240th anniversary of the Battle of Cape. French President Emmanuel Macron said that it's important for Europe to stop being naive and assert its independence from the United States. The French are so outraged that the defense minister pulled out of talks with the UK, and in an unprecedented move, France even recalled its ambassadors to Australia and the US. To gain further insight into this diplomatic row, joining me is Bruce Haig, an Australian political commentator, author, and former diplomat. He served in several countries, first in South Africa, where he made friends with anti-apartheid activists and even helped some of them escape the country. He also served in Afghanistan, Iran, Indonesia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Sri Lanka. Bruce, it's great to have you on. Welcome to the Communiqué.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So, Bruce, when we speak about the relationship that Australia has with France, how does AUKUS and the diplomatic fallout that's resulted from it impact the relationship?
Richard, that's a good question because the French are quite influential, as you know, in Europe. Britain's out of it, much to everybody's delight, I would hope and think. But in its present form, I mean, Britain is still hasn't had the social revolution that it needs. It's still a hugely unequal society and racist to boot. But so France has got a considerable influence in Europe, and it will bring that influence to bear. Merkel's about to go. We don't know who will replace her, but whoever replaces her will not have the experience that Merkel had. So Macron is now a senior statesperson in Europe, and he's really angry. So I can't imagine that the trade deal that was being drawn up will happen. It'll be pushed to one side, and it won't be revived, I don't think, until Morrison's government has been voted out of office in Australia.
So we know that they didn't tell the French about their plans to rip up this deal. Could you maybe tell us about who else was left in the dark in terms of the Australian government, the Australian Defence Forces? Because there were also other people in Australia who didn't know about this. Is that correct?
Yes, that's certainly, it seems that way. It would seem that this is a deal that's been done between people in the United States or people around Biden and Morrison and some of his staff members. But it seems, and maybe it includes Dutton, who's the Minister for Defence, but it seems it didn't include the Department of Defence because they wrote a letter to the French, which the French received on the same day that the Australians broke the contract. So, to me, officials within our Department of Defence were not in the loop. They don't know the cost. I mean, this when you're spending 85 to 100 billion of taxpayers' money on an item like as large as this, you would normally go out to contract and so look, and the lead-in time with the French would be over a period of 6 months or a year of saying, look, we're going to have to break this contract and discuss the terms of breaking the contract and all those sorts of things so that you didn't upset the French. So the submarine deal, they're saying we wouldn't get the submarines until 2040 at the earliest and maybe 2050, which to me means that the submarine deal isn't a real deal at all. It's a smokescreen in order to get the United States into Australia and get their nuclear submarines based in Fremantle, at the Garden Island and in the Northern Territory, perhaps build another port, get their stealth bombers and B-52s permanently based in Tyndall Air Force Base in the north, and maybe build some other bases in Northern Australia.
So what are the motivations behind AUKUS? Why this pact at this point in time with these three countries?
The Americans are getting increasingly worried about, they've got themselves into a mindset. They're paranoid. They're feeding off their own hysteria about China. So they've got themselves into a mindset that they need to act very, very quickly. And so they came up with this idea of gazumping the French and their submarine deal, pushing the French out of, or marginalising the French in the Pacific, giving the primary role to the US. Johnson's just a hanger-on in all of this. He's trying to get some British glory day back after the mess up of Brexit, and it's a complete mess. So Johnson's a hanger-on, and America is now happy enough to have Johnson hanging on, but wants Australia as a base for its naval assets and for army. I don't know what they're going to use the army for, to occupy the islands in the South China Sea But I mean, they just want a presence in Australia, an increased military presence, and that increased military presence will give them control over a greater control over the Australian political process. So AUKUS is really about the Americans wanting to use Australia, as they did in the Second World War, as a kind of a large aircraft carrier, and give some legitimacy to what they're on about, which is confronting China because of their fear of China's rivalry.
So when we talk about trade, Australia's largest trading partner is China. How does this whole situation affect the relationship with the Chinese? This has always seemed odd to me. Australia needs China, and yet we have this behavior from the United States pushing Australia into confrontation. So how does this affect the relationship with China? What's the Chinese response been? And what's the response been from the other countries and territories in the Indo-Pacific to this pact?
Well, in Southeast Asia, other countries are not at all happy. They haven't expressed themselves forcefully in public, but behind the scenes, they're very angry and concerned. China, of course, they won't deal with Morrison, and they won't deal with his government. Morrison doesn't have any life experience. He is unable to process these sorts of relationships. He hasn't got a clue. China is now being referred to within circles in Australia, certainly by the Americans, but we've picked up, they're the enemy. So, we're referring to our major trading partner as the enemy. I don't even begin to understand the logic of that. From Australia's point of view, China's not going anywhere, and neither are we. As much as we'd like to sit offshore from America, it's not going to happen. We're firmly grounded here at the bottom of Asia, and that's our future and that's our destiny. And China is China, and it's going to be there, and it's going to continue to influence the states around it in the Pacific and in the region. Countries are going to pick up with Belt and Road, and they're going to want the infrastructure that China's providing and promising.
Bruce Haig, thank you so much for your time. Such a pleasure speaking with you. Despite the claim that AUKUS will boost peace and stability in the region, it already seems to be achieving the opposite. China will perceive a heightened presence of a foreign military as a threat, just like any country would, and naturally want to defend itself. Having more British, American, and Australian forces trying to provoke China is only going to escalate things and maybe lead to an arms race, or worse, a military confrontation. The Americans said they would bring peace and stability to the Middle East. Look how that turned out. America and Britain, they just go park fleets of warships, they fly nuclear bombers on Iran's doorstep, or in this case, China's doorstep, and then talk about countering China as if China is the one camped out in the Florida Keys. This is absurd. Just imagine the reaction if China put its warships in the English Channel or off the coast of California. They would lose it. Just look at the response when the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba in 1962. They're still talking about it to this day. Last time I checked, China isn't the one who just pulled out of Afghanistan after occupying it for 20 years. China didn't commit war crimes in Iraq and Libya. China doesn't have 800 military bases around the world. China offers a different economic model, an alternative way of doing things that doesn't involve aggression and imperialism. China's way of doing things is based on agreement and cooperation, and is soon to become the world's largest economic power. Australia has always clung to Uncle Sam's coattails and needs the United States to feel that it can project a certain degree of power. Now, the United Kingdom longs for the old days of its empire. It just wants to appear relevant after Brexit. That's why they formed AUKUS. As for America, after Afghanistan, America needs a new enemy to justify its $740 billion military budget and to keep expanding its empire and ensure corporate profits. And this is the crux of the issue. Capitalists, imperialists, they hate competition. They want to monopolize. They want to assert dominance and control over every market, every situation. And in the great power struggle between the West and China, the West is scared. Not because China actually poses a threat, but because China proposes an alternate way of doing things and is able to rival them through a different model, making theirs look outdated, weak, and obsolete. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communiqué.